Once again, welcome, and I'm going to let Dave Lalman introduce himself and take over the webinar.
Thanks, Paul. So Extension beef cattle specialist, we appreciate you taking time out of your day to join us here today. My topic, I think, was reducing supplementation costs, and we'll talk some about that. Dr. Beck did a good job covering that subject 3 or 4 weeks ago now, but his presentation is available at beef.okstate.edu, as are all of these different series that we've hosted over the last 2 years. I don't know, there must be 55 or 60 videos on different topics available there at that website that you're welcome to go and view if you need maybe a good sleeping pill or something like that. But anyway, beyond supplementation costs, I'm just going to throw out some ideas. Those of you that have followed our extension program have heard of some of these, but I think a few of them will be new to some of you and may give you some ideas on how you might be able to maintain a nucleus of cows, and in a year when hay supplies are hard to find and expensive, perhaps improve on your efficiency and cut back on your costs in a tough year. So let's just get started. I'm going to show you some slides here first, and then my plan is to move over to calculator and kind of demonstrate a few of these concepts, but some of them are just kind of general things that I can show you in PowerPoint quickly, and then move on to a demonstration. So here are the things I thought that might be interesting. I'm not going to cover early weaning in any detail. You can see Paul covered this in our cow-calf corner newsletter last week. That's details about the early weaning, management are available in that newsletter article, as well as in the sunup video, television video. Those links are all available again on that website. But essentially, in a year, especially in years when feed costs are particularly high, when cows are a little bit thin through the summer due to drought or just low forage production, and therefore their performance hasn't been as good as normal, or in a year when your winter forage supply, whether that be standing forage or hay, is really short and therefore expensive, early weaning is generally, not always, not for everyone, but generally speaking, it's a really good and one of the first management strategies we reach to. Why? Well, the primary reason is that early weaning cuts way back on the cow's nutrient requirements in a spring calving system that occurs earlier in the year, so that you can allow that cow to build some body condition going into the winter and hopefully retain that body condition longer with lower feed costs, because she doesn't have the extra 20 to 50% protein and energy requirements needed to produce milk. Okay, that's the bottom line. Yes, you have to have a plan for those calves that you might wean at, say, 425 pounds instead of 550 pounds or whatever. Whether it be early marketing plan, or whether you devise a plan to sort of background those calves or wean them and kick them back out on pasture with a supplement, put them up in a dry lot or sacrifice pasture and feed a total mixed ration. I mean, whatever works for you. But if you contact one of these area livestock specialists or an extension educator, maybe your feed industry professional, to help work through the options there to feed or supplement those calves, or your marketing professional, and perhaps get those calves marketed, yes, at a lighter weight, but probably at a higher price per pound. So that's the early weaning idea, and obviously is something that a lot of people ought to be considering this year. The other one that I want to talk about just for a few minutes, everybody's probably noticed this, but the cost of beef cattle protein supplements has increased substantially in Oklahoma the last few years? Well, in general, one of the major factors there is that we have essentially lost production of cottonseed meal, in central Oklahoma. We used to have a really nice operation, producers co-op there in Oklahoma City. That is no longer producing cottonseed meal that the beef cattle industry used to great effect for many, many years. Consequently, cottonseed meal or any protein supplement that makes a good cube. All right, now that's a big nuance there. Distillers dried grains is a good protein supplement and a pretty good buy in the protein market, but it does not make a very good cube. You'll wind up with lots of fines and so on if you blend it with other commodities. Now, the feed industry has gradually begun to overcome that challenge, but some of the feed mills still don't have the technology available to make a good cube blended with wheat mids and so on. And therefore, the cost of a 20% cube, which by the way, has somewhere in the neighborhood of 20% cottonseed meal, and the other 80% is going to be wheat mids with a little bit of binder and some vitamins and minerals. Consequently, apparently, some of the really large privately owned feed companies in Oklahoma have been marketing a lot more lower protein cubes than traditionally. 20% cube is by far and away the most popular supplement to beef cattle in Oklahoma. And I think the reason is because it's so flexible. It can be fed to calves, to cows, a wide range, and over, it fits. If you increase or decrease the amount you're feeding, you can just make it work in a lot of situations. But therefore the amount of that sold is that product sold through the commercial feed industry is far and above any other feed product sold to the beef cattle industry. More recently, the use of the lower protein cubes has been growing, apparently, according to some of my friends in the feed industry, has been growing dramatically. So I just want to address that for a few minutes and show you, what you might expect in terms of forage intake and digestion and maybe animal performance. Let's see. So let's talk about also limit feeding a total mixed ration. We've done a lot of educational programs on that over the years. It works really good if you have the labor resources and probably the feeding equipment needed to make something like that work. But some of the larger operations do have the capability to implement a limit feeding strategy and with a total mixed ration. It doesn't work for everybody, and it does work better when corn is $3 a bushel, right? And right now it's more like in the sixes. So it's not inexpensive, but I'll show you an example. Actually, it winds up in a cost per cow per day, feed cost per cow per day. It's fairly competitive even yet today with higher hay prices and higher concentrate prices. Then let's talk just real quickly about use of an efficient hay feeder and limiting access to hay. I think those are things that a lot of folks could implement and perhaps already have. So this is just a general kind of perspective on a cow's protein and energy requirements relative to her stage of production. In the fall calving herd, we're approaching this time of year where people would be coming up on weaning here before too long, and then they would enter that second stage of gestation after the calf is weaned, and therefore for a period of time, both their protein and their energy requirements are going to be very low. It's a good time of the year to perhaps, depending on the quality of your forage, it may be, I should say, a good time of year for you to feed just a little bit of supplement to maximize forage intake and digestibility in cases where forage is not limiting. And so that's where perhaps the 38% cube versus the 20% cube versus the 16% cube comes into play. So I just want you to recognize when we're talking about the concentration of protein in the supplement that you purchase, the response to protein is relative. So in other words, if you don't quite feed 100% of the cow's requirement for protein, it isn't like those cows are going to drastically lose condition and performance. They are not going to, you would expect over a long time period, they wouldn't perform as well as they would had you met their requirements. But it's not like they drastically lose weight and body condition as if you weren't feeding any supplement at all. It's a graduated response. So let me just show you some data. This is a really nice data set out of Kansas State. And they conducted these experiments both on native range land, but then when they brought the cattle in to do these digestion studies, they used extremely low quality prairie hay. This is 2% protein and almost 77% neutral detergent fiber. And let me tell you, I mean, that's like hay here, Stillwater, Oklahoma, that was harvested the end of August. Very low quality prairie hay. Then they fed to different treatment groups of cattle there in their metabolism center at K-State. They fed no supplement at all, about 0.4 of a pound a day of a highly degradable protein source, 0.8, 1.2, and 1.6 pounds. So you can kind of look at the response in terms of forage intake, microbial efficiency, and total diet, total tract digestibility over a range of protein supplement. Now, what you see here, especially with that first increment of protein supplements, so recognize that this 0.4 pound would basically be like feeding 2 pounds of 20s, right? It would also be the equivalent or near equivalent of feeding 1 pound of a 38% product. They got a big boost in forage intake. Now, this does not meet these. If we were to calculate it, use our calculator software program, and we put in 0.4 a pound or 2 pounds of 20 on 2% hay, it's going to say she's considerably deficient in protein. But look at the nice boost you get on intake, microbial efficiency, as well as total diet digestibility. As you continue to increase the protein, this 1.2 pounds, if you calculate it using the 2% protein forage source, this winds up being a diet that's about 8.5% crude protein to a 1,200 pound cow. Okay, so in general, we think at about 7.5 to 8% is about the requirement of a gestating cow in that second stage of gestation. And so they're pretty close here to what we would calculate as a requirement. You still get a continued increase or boost in forage intake up to that point. You're also still getting an increase in microbial efficiency. And then digestibility, actually total tract digestibility actually tailored off here after that first big boost. And so we're not increasing digestibility much with these additional amounts of protein, but we are continuing to increase the microbial efficiency up to what we calculate as their protein requirement. Okay. And so what that means is that, you know, you're going to maximize forage intake and you're going to maximize digestibility up to their requirement, but you're also providing that cow's protein needs at kind of an optimum level here when that protein requirement is met, because 60 to 70%, generally speaking, of a cow's protein supply comes from the microbes that are flushed out of the rumen into the small intestine, digested there by the strong acids secreted there in the small intestine and then absorbed through that intestinal wall. 60 to 70% of their protein requirements are actually met by those microbes, or those bugs, if you will, protozoa, bacteria, and so on in the rumen. So that's the advantage of going on up there. But you can see that you're still getting nice improvements with each increment of increased protein supply. Okay, and then if you just look at it from a graphical standpoint, don't worry about these units here. All I want you to do is notice DOMI is digestible organic matter intake. So the total energy that these cows are consuming in this experiment continue to increase until they got to about that 1.2 pounds per day amount of supplement. Okay, and this is the diet that's about 8.5% crude protein. But notice, you've got continued gradual increase in intake, digestibility, microbial efficiency up to that point to where, yes, you're going to notice some decreased performance, but you're still going to get some good out of that supplemental protein if you're not meeting the animal's requirement. Now, one more thing about feeding a 16 where you might have normally fed a 20. Obviously, this is the kind of year when people are going to be looking for energy to replace forage. And so I had several questions about, well, can we cut back out on the amount of hay, feed the hay by rolling it out or feeding it a bunk or something like that, and then feed 7, 8, maybe even up to 9 pounds of a lower protein cube. Yes, it's going to be expensive, but will that work? And the answer is yes. The cost per pound of protein in the 16 here, if I can find it, the cost per pound of protein is still less expensive in the 20% cube, and that's normally the case. The cost per unit of energy is lower in the 16% cube. So, how do you know which you should prioritize? Well, that's where we encourage you to work with your feed industry person, get on, download the calculator program, plug in your own values, and work through those scenarios so that you're evaluating their protein needs and their energy needs at the same time. I see Mike's raised his hand. Paul, do we have a question there?
Yes, you have a question. Please explain how to calculate protein pounds per day on a 20% range cube or a 16% cube.
So Mike, do you mean the protein delivered to the cow per day with the 20% cube? If so, and you can just type in your answer there, but if so, so it's just, 1 pound of a 20% cube, 20% is 20% crude protein. 1 times 20% or 0.2 is 0.2 pounds of crude protein. So if on the other hand, you're feeding 2 pounds of a 20% crude protein, that's 2 times 0.2 would be 0.4 pounds per head per day in that case. Okay, you bet. All right. So that's kind of that issue in a nutshell. If you've gone to the lower protein cube because they're substantially cheaper now, well, I mean, one thing I didn't mention, think about the location of where these feed companies are sourcing wheat mids. Basically, it's locally. Okay, it's in Oklahoma. I know one of our feed industry groups are sourcing a good amount of their wheat mids from the Wichita area. So it doesn't have to come very far. The cottonseed meal now and the other protein sources, they have to come from a long ways away. And so the increased price of freight and so on and so forth have had a dramatic impact on that. Feel free and please do type in other questions, comments, observations about, particularly the folks that like and want to use cubes. That's going to be a big issue. If you have questions or comments, please don't hesitate to type in a comment or a question there. Okay, so a little bit about minimizing hay waste. First of all, rolling hay out, is a great option because you can control the amount that the cows get. Now, these cattle, when it's not icing over like you see here, or snowing, wet snow, they can get to a lot of forage out here. But if there wasn't much forage and the only thing they're getting, or most of what they're getting is coming from the hay that you're feeding each day, you're going to have to feed hay every day, right? If you put out enough hay in a pasture that's short of forage to supply them for 3 or 4 days, they're going to waste a lot of it. Lay on it, defecate on it, urinate on it, stomp around on it, and so on day 1 and 2. And by day 3 and 4, the forage that's left will not be palatable. So it does increase the labor requirement, maybe the equipment depreciation and so on, because you have to feed it every day. But in a year like this, you can put out 50% of what you think their forage requirement is. You can put out 70%, 80%. I mean, you can control how much they get. And that's the beautiful thing about rolling hay out. And if you sort of read the feed bunk like the feed yards do, and basically have the cows clean it up each and every day, you can really cut back on the waste of hay, which is kind of a rampant problem in our industry, truthfully. And we'll talk about that here now. So a lot of you probably seen our studies and work and data on the hay feeders, and I'm going to share that with you here real quick again. But our suggestion is, particularly in years like this when hay is expensive, use a hay feeder that's designed to minimize hay waste. And there are major differences in hay feeders. Now, obviously the challenge is some of them are really convenient and inexpensive, and that comes into play. But those may not be as effective in a year like this when hay is so expensive. So real quick, just to work down through these, and the study we did several years ago had a student that wanted to compare real popular hay feeders. And here's what he came up with. This one I checked online. I built a lot of these when I was a teenager in ag shop, and they're inexpensive today. These would cost around $250. They only weigh 100 pounds, so they're easy to pick up and flip up and roll on to a new spot and drop over another bale. Really convenient. Has what we call an open bottom here, so there's no solid sheeting. And then this one happens to have 6 feeding stations. So definitely a minimum hay feeder that's light, convenient to move, and inexpensive. Okay, and then in this study, we looked at one of these polyethylene pipe feeders. This company produces a lot of different variations. This one is just pretty similar to that minimal feeder that I showed you previously. It costs about $350. It's really light, also convenient to move. It also has an open bottom. Again, this company produces feeders that do have a sheeted bottom. They also produce feeders with baskets. This just happens to be the one that we use for this study. These are real popular feeders in Oklahoma. We see them all over the place. This one also has 6 feeding stations. Okay, this is a little higher end round bale feeder. Justin called this one sheeted bottom steel ring because it's got this solid, I think that's about 18 inches of sheeted bottom here. It is heavier. It costs more today. These are about $550. It weighs about twice as much, so not as convenient to move. There's that metal apron. This one has these kind of fancier feeding bars, and it's got 16 of them. So this is basically designed for 16 cows to eat at a time. Okay, and then this is kind of some people call it a modified cone feeder, or some people consider it a basket feeder. But essentially, we talk a lot about this particular feeder because we did our experiment with these, and we've done several experiments with these. But I think the important thing here is that you've got 2 features. One is you have a solid sheeted bottom, just like the previous feeder, and then you have some sort of a basket mechanism at the top. The primary purpose of the basket mechanism, you can see this ring is tighter here. It holds the bale together longer in the middle of the feeder, and therefore it creates feeding space for the cow's head. Okay, she has to put her head into the bunk and reach forward to get that hay. And then when she pulls hay out, she's chewing on it, or she takes half step back or something. Anything that falls out of her mouth drops right back into the feeder. That is the two key features that we think are really important in terms of hay savings. This happens to be a Bextra model, but there are several feeders on the market that have those same two features. It's more expensive, $825 currently, 300 pounds, so they're not convenient to move. It does have the same 18-inch metal apron, and this particular feeder has 9 different feeding stations. Okay, here's our data from that experiment. Maybe the most important line is this waste as a percent of the original bale weight. The modified cone, that Bextra feeder, we did several experiments and very consistently get around 5 to 6% hay waste. The open bottom steel ring, the poly open bottom feeder, both right at around 21%. So it's always kind of amazed me that, you know, those lower end, yes, more convenient, yes, less expensive hay feeders without, you know, just a lot of structure to hold the hay in, particularly at the bottom, you know, waste up to 21% of our hay crop. Maybe this is a good time to mention that, you know, it depends on how you consider hay waste. You know, if you can roll it out and leave the waste out in the pasture, it's actually a nutrient source, or can be. And so people would look at that differently. I'm not saying that the waste is a total, you know, waste of resources, nutrients in particular, because it does have some value in some cases, unless it just piles up in a dry lot somewhere, and then it's probably doesn't have any value at all. The ring feeder, the yellow feeder with the sheeted bottom, wasted about 13%. So you gained about half as much just with the sheeted bottom. And so if you don't do anything else and you have open bottom feeders, you notice a lot of hay waste, find a way to put something around the bottom 18 inches or so of your hay feeders, and you'll notice a dramatic improvement in terms of hay waste. Okay, so there, I'm going to show you some pictures then. What we did, the students would come out on these big concrete slabs, and we'd basically sweep and clean the concrete pad off, put a new bale into the hay feeder, and we'd start from there. And then once that bale was put in there, every 24 hours, the students would come back out, sweep up and weigh on an electronic scale any hay that dropped outside of this ring on the feeder. Any hay laying out here was considered waste at that point, and it was cleaned up at 24-hour increments. So as I go through these slides, this is the hay waste at 24 hours on that bale, and you can see there's, you know, considerable amount out here towards the outside. This is day 2, 48 hours. There's not much additional hay waste here. There is some up close to the feeder, it looks like, on this day, and very little back here. 72, about the same story, scattered hay waste there. It's interesting, on these hay feeders, we noticed over time that as the hay drops below this ring in the basket and gets down into here, you start to have more hay waste. And that's what you see here in this picture. That's when the cows seem to be able to, well, they get more hay closer to the edge of the feeder here, and it's just easier for them to pull it out, and they do. So here, this is the open bottom steel ring. This is obviously day 1, right before we've turned the cows back in here. This is 24 hours. You can see the obvious substantial increase in hay waste at 24 hours. This was all cleaned up, swept perfectly clean. We come back on hour 48. Basically, you got the same story on day 2. There's some hay waste on day 3, but it's not, I guess I wouldn't consider it to be terrible there. But kind of intermediate on hour 96 as well. Okay, so other ways to limit access to hay. Let's talk about that for just a minute. So some folks would have the capability to if you have to feed in a round bale ring, perhaps set up 2, 3, 4 round bale rings, whatever matches the size of your cow herd, in either a dry lot or a sacrifice pasture somewhere where you can open the gate, let the cows into the hay, and then later in the day, push the cows out and shut the gate. This is one experiment that was conducted at the University of Minnesota, and they let cows have access to hay 6 hours, 14 hours, or 24/7. And you can see here, this is really nice quality, as I recall, grass alfalfa hay mix. But at 6 hours, these big old cows consume 21 pounds, at 14, 24. At 24 hours, they consume 27 pounds. So hay intake continued to going up all the way out through 24 hours. But this was nice quality hay. To meet their requirements, if they're already in good condition, you could limit their intake. And you can see here, these cows continue to gain weight even with 6 hours of access. They gained 27 pounds. I don't remember the days now, or there's 60 or 90 day period, but anyway, 36 pounds at 14 hours and 51 pounds. So, you know, this probably points out that if your cows are in poor condition and your hay quality is moderate, this may not be a good idea. This was really nice quality hay. They gained weight even on 6 hours of access. But this is not going to work very well for 2-year-olds. It's not going to work very well for older cows that maybe have marginal teeth, having a hard time already maintaining their body condition. You know, the better the hay quality, you know, the better it might work for the really young cows and the really old cows. But you might keep that in mind if you consider implementing a program like this. But if you have decent quality hay and cows that have relatively low protein and energy requirements, like those cows in the middle of gestation after their calves are weaned, this is a great way to cut way back on the amount of hay that you need through the winter. We did a couple of projects here at Oklahoma State. We looked at kind of the standard 24-hour, we stack technology. So we call this stacking technology. And so what we did was we thought that we assumed the standard protocol was 24 hours access to hay, a typical hay feeder. And we were a little bit conservative here. We used the yellow sheeted ring feeder as the control. And we didn't have any feed additive in this one. In the technology group, we gave the cows only 7-hour access to prairie hay. We did give them a protein supplement. And then we used the basket feeder that also had the sheeted ring feature. So that Bextra feeder that had both of those features. Okay, what happened? Well, this was a year when our prairie hay was harvested a little bit late, well, considerably late actually that year. And by the time we got it harvested, it was really, really dry, short stem length or particle size on this hay. And when you took the net wrap off of these bales, they really fell apart. And we had a lot of hay waste, as you can see. Even in this better feeder, we just had a lot of hay waste. But when we limited access, used the better feeder, we had pretty good results. And this was at 24 hours after that bale was put in here. This is 24 hours after this bale is put in here. And you can just see that there's a lot less of that hay, a lot more of it in the feeder, a lot less out here on this concrete slab. You can see we didn't have to get very fancy about our pen to turn the cows in and let them back out. We just went and bought some cattle panels and T-posts. Okay, so here's the data on that project. Let's see, let's look at the hay waste here. It went from 25%. So remember, in the previous study on the yellow sheeted bottom feeder, we had 13% hay waste. This time with that really dry, short leafed prairie hay, it just crumbled, and we had 25% waste. So dramatic waste using that yellow feeder under those conditions. And then the technology, we actually had 12% waste. Well, for one cow over about a 60-day period, about 61 days, as I recall, this basically amounts to a 17% reduction. Now, when I say net disappearance here in this row of data, that includes the hay that the cows consumed and the hay that was wasted. So all the hay that actually disappeared, consumption and waste together, minus 17%. That's that much hay you wouldn't have to come up with. Then on the second experiment, we added to the stack technology, we added ammoniation. Now, this is another one of those technologies that probably not going to fit a lot of people. But if you can ammoniate low quality prairie hay, you can basically turn it into really high quality prairie hay, or something that's about like a moderate quality Bermuda grass hay. You can improve the quality dramatically. If you're interested in this technology, how to go about it, if you have access to anhydrous ammonia, you can just check our fact sheet on ammoniating low quality hay for beef cows, or talk to one of your extension educators about that technology. So here we had the same control, 24 hours, the yellow hay ring. I'm not going to talk about the feed additive in this particular project, but here we've got technology 6 hours. So we dropped it down to 6 hours because we knew it was going to be higher quality hay. Of ammoniated hay, we used the modified cone feeder like we did in the previous study. So we stacked one more technology on top of there. What happened then? So in this experiment, hay waste in the standard, this is at, as I recall, I think it was the same really low quality, dry, short stem length hay. And you can see we had very high waste out of that pretty nice feeder, that Franklin Industries yellow feeder, and only 7% in the 4 technology treatment group that had 6 hours a day access. These cows were lactating in this year. I guess that's the big difference here. And so we did not feed, well, all we did was supply a high protein supplement to these lactating cows to make sure that they consumed and digested all the hay they could. And therefore, since we didn't supply any supplemental energy, these cows lost a pretty good bit of weight and body condition. But look at the savings over a 62-day period here, as I recall. These cows in the standard program required you to purchase another 31%. So getting pretty close to this strategy, maybe being able to limit hay waste or hay use by nearly a third. So anyway, hopefully some of that will be helpful to some of you. So let me, I'm going to stop sharing this. I'm going to jump over to our calculator program. Paul, do we have any questions you'd like to address right now?
We have one question. You talked about feeding a protein cube every day. Can the protein cubes be fed alternate days and still maintain the cow?
Yeah, certainly. And a lot of data on that. And the higher protein cubes are fit well in we call that interval feeding, in an interval feeding system where you're feeding every other day, or you're feeding on Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. Now, in a year like this, when people are feeding more of the lower protein cube to supply more energy and replace hay with the concentrate feed, that's where it gets more challenging. And I'm going to give you an example here. Again, that's kind of a last ditch effort to maintain a group of cows. In most cases, that's what that's going to wind up being. It'll be expensive and certainly not something we recommend most of the time, but it'll be one way that some people can hang on to a nucleus of cows. But if you get up there to feeding, somewhere in a neighborhood, you need to deliver the equivalent of 6, 7, 8, 9 pounds of any kind of feed per day, and then you're trying to interval feed that, well, you might be needing to deliver 10, 11, 12, 13 pounds per feeding. And that's probably really pushing it. We think that the maximum on a mature cow that you ought to ever consider feeding is around 1% of their body weight. And that's pushing it. I wouldn't guarantee that you wouldn't wind up with some foundered cows, even at 1% of body weight. So I'd say certainly per feeding, make sure you always keep it under 1% of their body weight. So less than 12 pounds on a 1,200-pound cow per feeding. So, you divide that by 7, and that gives you the amount that you're delivering per day. Good question. But yes, it works great. If you're trying to feed 3 or 4 pounds, or even only 2 pounds per head per day, the interval feeding system works very well. Now, excuse me, stop share. Let's go to the calculator program. Okay. All right, so here I just want to show you real quick. I'm not going to bother to walk all the way through calculator. You can download this, play with it yourself, and if you have issues or questions, our area livestock specialists are really handy with this program, and our extension educators are as well. And so you can contact them with questions or us either way. But I've already got feeds pulled in here to kind of make our demonstration go a little bit quicker here today. Let's go back to the cattle page right quick. I'll just show you. I've got 1,200-pound cows in here. I've got them in at mid gestation right now. I've got a 90-day feeding period, and let's just turn off this option here for an ionophore. I'm going to say they're in a body condition score 5 at the beginning of this feeding period, and we want them to be in a body condition score 5 at the end of this feeding period. So back to the balancer page. So I've got this pretty well balanced using mature prairie hay. This is about 4.5% crude protein hay. As I recall, it's around 53% TDN, if that gives you kind of a benchmark for the hay quality in this example. At 25.2 pounds and 5 pounds of 20s, 20 pounds of hay, we're meeting this. This is about what the calculation thinks these cattle would consume. Were they to have free choice access to either hay or low quality native range, that's about how much it anticipates they would consume. We've just about met their protein requirement. So 1.0 would be right where the software estimates their protein requirement is. And so we're real close to 1.0 here in terms of this protein ratio, meaning we're real close to meeting their protein requirement. These cows, in this case, since they're in mid gestation, are gaining some weight, 1.16 pounds per day. It looks like about 0.9 of that pounds per day is the maternal tissue gain. In other words, the cow gaining weight. About 1/3 of that pound is actually going to the fetus. So she's gaining weight, but 1/3 of that weight she's gaining is actually the fetus inside of her and the pregnancy tissue associated with that fetus. But the cow should be gaining body fat because she's gaining just a little bit of weight on top of that. Okay, so I just wanted to show you that's 5 pounds of 20s. What if we just replace the 5 pounds of 20s, and because they're considerably cheaper, we just go with 5 pounds of 16. Well, basically, this is what that looks like. You're still, doesn't influence the feed intake ratio here, but notice that we're down to 0.88. So we're feeding this cow about 88% of her protein requirement. If you go over here, you can see the crude protein. This cow actually requires about 1.84. She's getting about 1.62. So we're we're about 1/4 of a pound deficient in her protein supply. You can go back to the slides that I shared with you earlier and kind of get an idea of what that might do to her intake, digestibility, and microbial protein supply. So I just wanted to show you that. At some point, you are going to notice a little bit decline in those animals' performance, if you get too far down in that protein ratio. But the other thing to consider here is grazing pressure and your stocking rate. So if the cattle have access to stockpile forage that has not been picked over previously, they're going to be able to select a higher quality diet. And this program might work really well in that situation, or under that 1.0 protein requirement might work well in that situation, because they're actually selecting a higher quality diet than what we've got back there in the feed list table. The more picked over it is, the longer they've been out on that same pasture, the lower the forage protein content is going to be, generally speaking. And that's when you'd be more concerned about this actually maybe being lower than you anticipate it to be. Okay, unless there's questions, that's enough about that. Now, what I want to show you is this is that radical limit feeding a concentrate diet to cows in a dry lot. Let's just use the same hay. And I just came up with this little diet the other day. This is actually a diet we've used here quite a bit, or something real similar. We're going to use about a third distiller's grains, somewhere around about a third rolled corn, and then a liquid feed is kind of ration conditioner to cut down on the dust, also deliver some non-protein nitrogen, vitamins, and minerals. Let's see, I think we had that in at 3. And then it's going to take a little bit of calcium supplement. If you look over here right now, okay, let's see, calcium. Yeah, we're deficient in calcium. You notice she needs 26 grams. No. Well, I'm not sure. It doesn't look like that's adding up, but I'm going to put in my calcium supplement. Yeah, looks like I need to work on that, Paul. Anyway, notice it's saying those cows will eat quite a bit. Well, obviously, if we fed them all they wanted, so I'm going to put 30 pounds in. Now, notice I entered this as a percentage, so my percentage adds to 100, and then you modify that feed intake number there. I've got it set on as fed, so we're formulating this diet on an as fed basis. Feed intake ratio is 1. Protein supply is 1.88. So that's telling me that I'm wasting a lot of protein here. It's getting basically urinated out on the ground. Projected weight gain 2.9 pounds a day. Well, we don't need that, right? And we're spending a lot of money at 332 a day, but you can limit feed a diet like this. So let's just back way off on the feed intake until we basically meet whatever performance goal or threshold we want. Right here, I've got it in at 16 pounds as fed, which this says turns out to be about 14.4 pounds of feed dry matter. The cows are gaining 0.73 pounds a day, so not quite as good as our cows on that hay diet a minute ago. Our cost is $1.77. Now, let's see, yesterday I had written down the other program, the hay program and supplement, was going to cost about somewhere between $2.15 a day to $2.25 a day. This one, with the commodity prices that I plugged into the feed list just yesterday, is going to cost feed costs of $1.77. Yes, obviously you've got to add the expenses of your equipment, the labor. You've got to feed a diet like this every day, about the same time every day. And the cows have to have adequate bunk space, because we're only feeding them about half of what they would normally feed on a dry matter basis they would normally consume each day, right? And so first few days they'll be hungry. Our experience has been, they might walk the fence and be sort of agitated for a few days until they get accustomed to this. But then after just a few days, they settle right down. And we've gotten along real well managing cows in a strategy like this over the last few years. So we have a fact sheet on details about a program like this and kind of give you some guidance on things that you might consider. So that's another option that might work for a few folks. All right, Dr. Beck, those are the main things I wanted to mention today, give people some options. Just open it up for questions if we happen to have any discussion.
Well, so far we have no other questions other than what you covered. Here's one that had just come in. Does the university happen to have this feed calculator available for other livestock species? We
do not. I'll put that on Dr. Beck's to-do list. How about? No, we don't. We just have this one for beef cattle. There are maybe some, well, I shouldn't say. As far as I'm aware, Paul, am I missing that? I don't think we have a swine, a dairy. I don't know what Dr. Heine uses for horses. I know she has some sort of a calculator. I actually think she relies on one that's online. But no, we don't have this same program available in other species.
We do have one for goats.
Okay.
With our award in his program.
Okay.
And then while you're still on this screen, you might talk a little bit about the amount of prairie hay, that 34%. You know, you've cut the intake in half, but
yeah, good point.
So they can kind of estimate how much they'll need each day per cow, kind of thing.
Yeah, I got my computer out here. So we're feeding 16 pounds times 0.34. So yeah, I mean, that's the point of the whole thing, right? For people that are really trying to find a way to maintain a few cows, now we're feeding 5.5 pounds of prairie hay a day. I think our rule of thumb is that they need to consume probably a minimum of 0.5% of their body weight to keep the rumen healthy in hay. Here we're feeding 5.5 pounds of hay per day. You know, if you were to let them eat all the hay they would want in our earlier example, I think it was 20 some pounds, but you know, a lactating cow can consume up to, you know, maybe up to 30. And then you add the waste on top of that. So definitely this is one way to cut way back on hay use.
Yeah, I was going to point out there is absolutely zero waste with this feeding program. So, you know, even if you're the most efficient in feeding long stem hay, there's still 7 to 10% waste with that, where with this, you know, they're hungry enough, they're going to consume it all.
The one other thing I might mention, looks like we got just a few minutes left here. Let me knock out this limit feeding ration here right quick. And let's go to the case where the gentleman wanted to know if he could feed a lot more cubes and roll out his hay. Let's just see what that looks like. So here, that looks like we're going to need a little bit more cubes because we're off on our protein still. Again, this might work okay, but you're not going to get optimal performance on those cows. So let's bump the cube up just a little bit more. And then, yeah, we're getting closer there. 20 pounds of intake. So there we're real close on our protein requirement. We're feeding the cows about 3/4 of what they would like to eat every day on an ad lib basis. Projected weight gain is about what I had previously in the limit feeding concentrate diet. We're at $2.22 a day. So it's not costing any more. Now, by the way, I've got this prairie hay plugged in at the feed list at $125 a ton, Brian, which is what you said. your hay's costing down there. So this would work. You know, again, you're going to have to manage limit feeding the hay and delivering a lot of the concentrate as well.
And that will concentrate should be fed every day.
Absolutely. Yes, you would not want to interval feed that much concentrate. No way.
We have a question from Gail Acton. Where is a place to get hay tested for protein content?
Good question. So there are numerous laboratories available. We have one here at Oklahoma State. You can just Google that. The easy way to remember it, I think, is I call it, we all refer to it as SWAFL, SWFAL. Brian, help me. It stands for Soil, Water,
Forage Analytical Lab.
Or SWFAL, soil, not sewage, soil, water, forage analytical laboratory here at OSU. Also, a really good place to go for that question is the National Forage Testing Association website. And they have a certification program for laboratories. And basically it's a quality control system. And so if the lab turns in their samples and they pass the test for certification, they get listed in the National Forage Testing Association website. And you can see all the contact information of those certified laboratories. It's a tremendous resource. And you can see all the certified laboratories in Oklahoma and surrounding states.
I posted the email or website for the forage testing, National Forage Testing Laboratory, and the SWAFL laboratory as well.
Dr. Biggs is rubbing off on you. You're getting more proficient all the time. All right. Well, hey, thanks everybody. Maybe another question.
I was going to ask you, Dave, you mentioned the industry going towards the wheat mids. You know, is there some thoughts on, you know, buying in bulk at certain times of the year? Do we have to avoid anything in there with that product?
You know, you mean like in terms of spoilage or something like that?
Yeah, if it gets too hot or anything like that.
I think the quality control in the commercial industry is going to take care of that. You know, if you're buying wheat mids bulk, you know, semi-load at a time or whatever, you know, you might need to pay more attention to that, because, yeah, there's been times, and, you know, we maybe have gotten a load of wheat mids that were a little bit too high in moisture, heated up, maybe molded, and so on. I think that's gotten better. Seems to me like that's gotten better over time. And Paul, what's your take on that question?
What was the question? I was typing the chat.
Yeah, sure. Should you, like in the heat of the summer, should you be concerned about purchasing cubes made out of primarily wheat mids from a spoilage standpoint? And my response was, I think the feed industry's got a really good handle on that. And from a moisture standpoint, I just haven't heard too many cases of that being an issue.
Yeah,
in a commercial product.
Yeah, the storage conditions are going to be important, but if you can keep them dry and they're cool whenever they get there, there's going to be very little spoilage. We have in the past gotten in cubes that were fresh out of the mill, or byproduct feeds that were fairly fresh out of the mill, and you know, they will draw some moisture whenever they cool down if they're not cooled properly, but that's not a very common event whenever that occurs.
Well, Paul, I'll just wrap it up here. I want to say thanks to everybody for those of you that have come to most of these, and even those of you that, and please do go back to the beef.okstate.edu and watch any of those videos that are available there. We will host another series starting sometime this fall. We're going to kind of see how things go here and see if we need to continue working on drought issues or other things that come up. But sometime this fall, if you don't mind us emailing you, you're on our list because you registered for this. We'll try to get the word out to you when that's going to happen. We really appreciate your participation.
So with that, thank you for attending